I never imagined I'd be handcuffed on my own property, accused of stealing a fence that my grandfather built 70 years ago. There I was, standing in my work boots and dust-covered jeans, watching a sheriff's deputy read me my rights, while my new neighbor filmed everything with her phone, claiming she'd caught a cattle thief red-handed. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 23 years as a property law attorney before retiring to run this ranch, and her little performance was about to cost her more money than she'd ever seen in her life. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been living on the same 800 acres of prime Texas rangeland that's been in my family since 1952. After 2 decades of handling complex property disputes in Dallas courts, I'd retired early to focus on what really mattered: raising quality cattle and maintaining the legacy my grandfather had built with his bare hands. The Thompson Ranch wasn't just my livelihood, it was a testament to 3 generations of hard work, careful planning, and respect for the land. Every morning at 5:30, I'd walk out onto my front porch with black coffee in my favorite ceramic mug, wearing my faded denim shirt and weathered brown Carhartt jacket, surveying an empire that represented everything I valued about rural Texas life. The rolling pastures stretched as far as you could see, dotted with black Angus cattle, and bounded by the original cedar post fence that my grandfather had installed himself during the summer of 1954. That fence wasn't just property boundary, it was family history, built to last by a man who understood that good neighbors respect each other's property lines. 18 months ago, everything changed when developers broke ground on Meadowbrook Estates, a luxury subdivision just 300 yards from my eastern property line. 47 custom homes, each priced at $600,000 and up, complete with homeowners association rules that governed everything from mailbox colors to grass height requirements. The kind of place where successful professionals could escape the city while maintaining the suburban lifestyle they were accustomed to. I didn't mind the new development initially. More residents meant more local tax revenue, better county services, and potential customers for the grass-fed beef I sold directly from the ranch. But I should have recognized the warning signs when the first residents started complaining about agricultural odors and livestock noise at the county planning meetings. City folks often move to the country expecting all the charm of rural life without any of the realities that make it possible. The trouble started with Stephanie Crowder, a 34-year-old pharmaceutical sales representative who'd moved down from Houston with her investment banker husband and twin 8-year-old daughters. Stephanie had that particular combination of entitlement and energy that turns neighborhood watch into neighborhood warfare. She dressed like she was always ready for a business meeting, even when walking her designer dog around the subdivision, wearing crisp white blouses with navy blazers, and carrying herself like someone accustomed to getting her way through persistence and perfectly styled blonde hair. Within 6 months of moving to Meadowbrook Estates, Stephanie had somehow gotten herself elected as HOA president, promising to maintain property values and ensure community standards that reflected the substantial investments residents had made in their dream homes. Her campaign rhetoric focused on protecting children and families from potential health and safety hazards, which I initially assumed meant typical suburban concerns like speeding cars and unleashed dogs. The first direct contact came on a Tuesday morning in March, when I was repairing a section of fence line that separated my cattle pasture from the subdivision's walking trail. I was replacing rotted cedar posts with new ones, using the same materials and techniques my grandfather had taught me, when Stephanie appeared at the property line, carrying her ever-present leather portfolio and wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. "Excuse me," she called out in that particular tone that immediately signals trouble approaching. "I'm Stephanie Crowder, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and I need to discuss some boundary concerns with you." I set down my post-hole digger and walked over to the fence line, trying to maintain the neighborly courtesy that had always characterized relationships in our rural community. "Good morning, Mrs. Crowder. I'm Marcus Thompson, and this is my family's ranch. What can I help you with?" Stephanie opened her portfolio and pulled out what appeared to be a professionally printed document with maps and legal terminology. According to our property survey, there seems to be some question about the placement of this fence line. Our residents have raised concerns that it may be encroaching on community property. I looked at the fence my grandfather had built, the same fence that had been surveyed and certified by 3 different county officials over the past 70 years, and tried to process what I was hearing. Ma'am, this fence has been here since 1954, long before your development existed. The property lines were professionally surveyed when your subdivision was platted, and there were no boundary disputes identified. Stephanie's smile tightened slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something harder underneath her professional demeanor. Property boundaries can shift over time, Mr. Thompson, and improvements made without proper permits can create legal complications. I'm sure you understand that we need to protect our community's interests. The way she said community interests made it clear that she considered my 70-year-old family ranch to be somehow incompatible with her vision of suburban paradise. I politely explained that all our boundary markers were properly maintained and legally established, but I could see that facts weren't going to deter someone who'd already made up her mind about what needed to happen. 3 days later, I found a certified letter in my mailbox on official Meadowbrook Estates letterhead, demanding that I provide property surveys, construction permits, and environmental impact assessments for what they called unpermitted fence installation and potential property line violations. The letter was signed by Stephanie Crowder, president, and included legal language about protecting community assets and maintaining property values that sounded impressive but had no actual legal authority behind it. That same week, I started noticing increased activity around my property line. Residents walking their dogs would stop to take photographs of my fence, and I spotted someone with surveying equipment taking measurements from the subdivision side. Stephanie had apparently convinced her neighbors that their expensive homes were somehow threatened by a fence that had been protecting cattle for longer than most of them had been alive. The situation escalated when I discovered that Stephanie had created a Facebook group called Meadowbrook Property Protection, where she was posting daily updates about what she termed ongoing boundary violations on adjacent property. Her posts included close-up photographs of my fence posts, dramatic descriptions of property rights violations, and calls for community action to protect their investments from encroachment by uncooperative neighbors. Reading through those posts, I realized that Stephanie had created an entirely fictional narrative where my grandfather's fence had somehow been installed illegally and was now threatening the legal rights and financial security of Meadowbrook Estates residents. She'd managed to turn a simple property boundary into a community crisis that required immediate intervention from authorities who actually had jurisdiction over property disputes. As someone who'd spent over 2 decades handling property law, I knew that Stephanie's claims were baseless and her demands had no legal standing. But I also recognized that she was building a case for harassment that could make my life complicated even if her legal theories were completely wrong. When dealing with someone who's organized their neighbors around false information, facts alone aren't always enough to resolve the conflict. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a Saturday morning in April when I was installing new corner posts to replace ones that had finally succumbed to 7 decades of Texas weather. I was using a hydraulic post driver, working methodically along the established fence line, when a sheriff's deputy pulled up to my gate with Stephanie Crowder riding in the passenger seat. Deputy Sarah Martinez stepped out of the patrol car with the professional demeanor of someone who'd rather be handling real crimes than suburban property disputes. Behind her, Stephanie emerged wearing what appeared to be her most authoritative outfit, a black blazer over white blouse with dark sunglasses that made her look like she was headed to a corporate board meeting rather than a rural fence line. "Mr. Thompson," Deputy Martinez called out, "I need to speak with you about a theft report that's been filed regarding fence materials." I set down my tools and walked over to the gate, trying to process what I'd just heard. Theft report. I'm working on my own fence, on my own property, using materials I purchased myself. Stephanie stepped forward with her portfolio open, pointing dramatically at the fence posts I'd been installing. "Officer, those are the exact materials that were stolen from our community storage area last week. Cedar posts, specific dimensions, matching what Mr. Thompson is currently installing without permission on disputed property. The audacity was breathtaking. She was claiming that I'd stolen fence materials to repair a fence that had existed since before she was born, on property that my family had owned continuously for over 70 years. But what made her accusation particularly clever was that it gave Deputy Martinez probable cause to investigate, even if the underlying claims were completely fabricated. "Sir, I'm going to need to see receipts for those materials and documentation of your authority to install fencing in this location," Deputy Martinez said, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but obligated to follow proper procedures when responding to theft reports. I pulled out my phone and showed her the Home Depot receipt for cedar posts purchased 3 days earlier, along with photos of the original fence installation from my grandfather's albums. But Stephanie wasn't finished with her performance. "Those receipts could be for any fence project," she insisted, her voice taking on the kind of righteousness that comes from believing your own lies. "The fact remains that materials matching this description were stolen from our property, and Mr. Thompson is the only person in the area conducting fence work." Deputy Martinez examined my documentation, while Stephanie continued building her case, claiming that surveillance cameras had captured suspicious activity around the community storage area and that several residents could testify about seeing me in the vicinity during the alleged theft. The whole thing was so elaborately constructed that I realized this wasn't spontaneous accusation. It was a carefully planned attack designed to criminalize my normal property maintenance activities. "Mrs. Crowder," I said, keeping my voice level despite my growing anger, "I've been repairing this fence for 20 years, using the same materials and techniques my grandfather taught me. If you're missing fence posts from your community storage, you might want to check with your construction crews rather than accusing neighbors of theft." But Stephanie had momentum now, and she wasn't about to let facts interfere with her narrative. "Mr. Thompson, your defensive attitude suggests you have something to hide. If these materials were legitimately purchased, why are you so resistant to proper investigation?" That's when I made the mistake that nearly landed me in handcuffs. I told Deputy Martinez that as a retired attorney who'd handled property disputes for over 2 decades, I knew my rights and wasn't required to submit to harassment from neighbors who didn't understand property law. The moment I mentioned my legal background, Stephanie's expression changed completely. The fake concern disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating that suggested this whole confrontation had been designed to test my response to authority. She'd been fishing for information about my background, and I'd just given her exactly what she was looking for. "So you admit you're a lawyer," she said triumphantly, as if this somehow proved her theft allegations. "That explains why you think you can ignore community standards and property rights, but legal training doesn't give you permission to steal from your neighbors." Deputy Martinez was clearly growing tired of Stephanie's theatrical accusations, but she still had to follow proper procedures when responding to theft reports. After examining my receipts and property documentation, she concluded that there was insufficient evidence to support criminal charges, but she advised both of us to resolve our boundary disputes through civil courts rather than continued confrontations. As the patrol car drove away, Stephanie turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This isn't over, Mr. Thompson. Our community won't be intimidated by someone who thinks legal education gives him permission to ignore other people's property rights." The threat was clear, and I realized that my casual mention of legal experience had escalated this conflict into something much more serious than a simple boundary dispute. Stephanie now knew she was dealing with someone who understood property law, which meant her future attacks would need to be more sophisticated and better documented. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since retiring from legal practice. I opened my home office filing cabinet and pulled out the original property surveys, deed records, and boundary documentation that my grandfather had meticulously maintained for over 60 years. If Stephanie Crowder wanted to play legal games with a retired property attorney, I was going to make sure I had every fact and document necessary to end this nonsense once and for all. What I discovered in those files would change everything about how I understood this situation and give me weapons that Stephanie never saw coming. The documents my grandfather had saved told a story I'd never fully understood about the strategic thinking behind our fence placement and the legal protections he'd built into our property rights. In 1954, when he'd installed the original fence line, he'd hired a professional surveyor and filed detailed boundary reports with the county to establish permanent markers that would prevent future disputes. But more importantly, I found correspondence between my grandfather and county officials from 1962, when the first residential development had been proposed for adjacent land. The county had required environmental impact studies and boundary agreements that specifically acknowledged the Thompson Ranch's existing fence line and guaranteed that future residential construction would not interfere with established agricultural operations. Among the documents was a 1963 easement agreement that granted the county permanent rights to use a 20-foot strip of my property for utility installation in exchange for legal guarantees that my fence line would be protected from future development challenges. Every property owner in what eventually became Meadowbrook Estates had signed acknowledgments of this easement when they purchased their homes, including specific language about respecting existing agricultural boundaries. The most damaging document for Stephanie's case was a professional survey from 2019, commissioned by the Meadowbrook Estates developers before construction began. The survey explicitly identified my fence line as the established eastern boundary of the development and included detailed photographs showing that all construction would respect existing property markers. Stephanie's claims about boundary disputes were not just wrong, they were contradicted by documents she should have received when she purchased her home. Armed with legal documentation that completely demolished Stephanie's accusations, I decided to take a proactive approach rather than waiting for her next attack. I contacted Tom Rodriguez, a private investigator I'd worked with during my legal career, and asked him to research Stephanie's background and recent activities in Meadowbrook Estates. What Tom discovered was both revealing and disturbing. Stephanie Crowder had a history of neighborhood conflicts dating back to her previous homes in Houston and Dallas. In each location, she'd eventually been involved in legal disputes with neighbors over property issues, HOA management, or community standards enforcement. Most tellingly, she'd been forced to resign from 2 previous HOA positions after being accused of harassment and misuse of association funds. Her current financial situation was also more precarious than her professional appearance suggested. Despite her expensive clothes and luxury home, Stephanie was carrying significant credit card debt and had been late on her mortgage payments twice in the past year. Her pharmaceutical sales income was entirely commission-based, and her recent performance had been declining, according to Tom's sources in the industry. Most revealing was what Tom discovered about Stephanie's activities since moving to Meadowbrook Estates. She'd been systematically documenting every aspect of my ranch operations, taking photographs, recording videos, and building what appeared to be a comprehensive case file about alleged property violations and environmental concerns. Her social media posts showed hundreds of images of my cattle, equipment, and fence line, along with detailed notes about times, dates, and weather conditions. This wasn't random neighbor harassment. It was an organized intelligence-gathering operation designed to find any possible violation or weakness that could be used against me. Stephanie had apparently decided that eliminating the ranch was necessary for protecting her property values, and she was approaching the problem with the systematic focus of someone who'd made it a full-time occupation. The theft report had been just the opening move in what was clearly a much larger campaign. Tom's investigation revealed that Stephanie had been contacting county officials, environmental agencies, and law enforcement organizations with complaints about my ranch operations. She'd filed noise, complaints, environmental violations, and even animal cruelty allegations, all designed to generate official investigations that would justify her claims about the ranch being a public nuisance. Most concerning was evidence that Stephanie had been organizing other Meadowbrook Estates residents around false information about property boundaries and legal requirements. She'd convinced several neighbors that my fence was illegally encroaching on community property and that the county was failing to enforce regulations that would protect their investments. Her ability to manipulate well-meaning residents into supporting her campaign was impressive and dangerous. Tom's report included recorded conversations with Meadowbrook Estates residents who'd been pressured by Stephanie to support her anti-ranch campaign. Several neighbors had expressed discomfort with her aggressive tactics, but they'd been intimidated by her claims about legal authority and community responsibility. Others had simply signed petitions and letters without fully understanding what they were supporting. The evidence painted a picture of systematic harassment disguised as community activism, organized by someone who understood exactly how to exploit suburban anxieties about property values and safety concerns. Stephanie wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was running a sophisticated campaign designed to use government agencies and community pressure to achieve goals she couldn't accomplish through legal means. The breaking point came when I received a certified letter from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, responding to complaints about alleged water pollution from my cattle operations. The letter demanded immediate inspection of my ranch facilities and threatened enforcement action if violations were discovered. The complaints had been filed by concerned community members who claimed that cattle waste was contaminating local groundwater and creating health hazards for residential areas. Reading through the TCEQ complaint, I recognized language and specific allegations that had appeared in Stephanie's social media posts. She'd managed to transform her unfounded concerns about ranch operations into official government investigation, complete with legal consequences if I failed to cooperate fully with environmental inspectors. The TCEQ inspection was scheduled for the following Monday, which meant I had less than a week to prepare for what would essentially be a formal audit of my entire ranching operation. Any violations, however minor, would vindicate Stephanie's claims and provide legal justification for the restrictions she'd been demanding. But what Stephanie didn't know was that I'd been expecting something like this ever since Tom Rodriguez had outlined the scope of her harassment campaign. I'd spent the previous month reviewing every aspect of my ranching operation with environmental consultants, updating documentation, and ensuring that my facilities exceeded all applicable regulatory standards. The TCEQ inspection was conducted by Jennifer Walsh, a senior environmental specialist with 15 years of experience evaluating agricultural operations throughout Texas. She spent 6 hours examining my cattle facilities, water management systems, and waste disposal practices, taking samples and reviewing documentation with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen every possible violation in her career. When Jennifer completed her inspection, she asked to speak with me privately about what she'd found. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I've inspected over 300 cattle operations during my career, and your ranch is among the cleanest and best managed facilities I've ever seen. Your water quality exceeds EPA standards by significant margins. Your waste management system is textbook perfect, and your record keeping is more detailed than what we require for operations 10 times this size." She handed me her preliminary report, which concluded that my ranch posed no environmental risks to surrounding properties and actually contributed to local water quality through proper land management practices. More importantly for dealing with Stephanie, the report specifically noted that the complaints triggering the inspection appeared to be based on misconceptions about agricultural operations rather than actual environmental concerns. "Between you and me," Jennifer added, "whoever filed these complaints doesn't understand how cattle ranching works. The allegations suggest contamination sources that don't exist with proper management, and several claims are physically impossible given your setup. This looks like harassment disguised as environmental concern." Armed with professional vindication from the state environmental agency, I was ready to end Stephanie Crowder's campaign of manufactured outrage. But first, I wanted to give her one opportunity to retreat gracefully before I used the full weight of my legal knowledge and documentation to destroy her credibility permanently. The community meeting that would decide everything was scheduled for Thursday evening at the Meadowbrook Estates Clubhouse. Stephanie had organized it as a presentation about ongoing environmental and property concerns affecting the subdivision, promising to reveal new evidence about violations that threatened community health and safety. According to the invitation she'd circulated, expert testimony would be provided about contamination risks and legal remedies available to protect residents' investments. I arrived at that meeting carrying a leather portfolio containing property surveys, environmental reports, and legal documentation that would expose every lie Stephanie had told over the past 6 months. But more importantly, I was prepared to reveal information about her background and financial motivations that would change how her neighbors understood this entire conflict. The clubhouse was packed with 42 Meadowbrook Estates residents, most dressed casually for what they expected to be an informational neighborhood meeting. Stephanie had positioned herself at the front of the room with a laptop and projection screen, wearing a black business suit that suggested she was about to deliver a boardroom presentation rather than neighborhood gossip. Her PowerPoint presentation was professionally designed and impressively detailed, featuring aerial photographs of my ranch, close-up images of cattle facilities, and charts showing proximity to residential areas. She'd clearly invested considerable time and effort in creating materials that would support her arguments about environmental risks and property violations. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie began in her most authoritative voice. Tonight, I'm going to show you evidence of ongoing violations that threaten our community's health, safety, and property values. The adjacent cattle operation has been operating without proper oversight, creating contamination risks that could affect our children and devalue our homes. For 20 minutes, she presented a masterclass in fear-mongering, using selective photographs and out-of-context information to paint my family's ranch as an environmental disaster waiting to happen. Her presentation included fake statistics about groundwater contamination, misleading information about property boundary disputes, and dramatic testimonials from residents who'd been convinced that their health was at risk. The audience was clearly affected by her presentation. Parents exchanged worried looks when she discussed potential risks to children, and several residents took notes about legal remedies and protective measures they might need to consider. Stephanie had successfully transformed a routine cattle operation into a community crisis that demanded immediate action. When she finished her presentation and asked for questions, I stood up in the back of the room and identified myself. Mrs. Crowder, I'm Marcus Thompson, and I operate the ranch you've been discussing tonight. I'd like to address some of the concerns you've raised. The room went silent as residents turned to look at the man who'd been portrayed as a dangerous neighbor for the past 30 minutes. Stephanie's confident expression flickered slightly, but she recovered quickly and invited me to respond to her presentation. I walked to the front of the room and plugged my laptop into her projection system, replacing her fear-mongering slideshow with legal documents and official reports that told a completely different story. The first slide displayed the TCEQ inspection report, with Jennifer Walsh's conclusion that my ranch exceeded all environmental standards and posed no contamination risks. This is the official report from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, I announced to the surprised audience. State environmental specialists spent 6 hours inspecting every aspect of my operation last week, and they concluded that Mrs. Crowder's environmental concerns are based on misconceptions rather than actual risks. I continued through my presentation, displaying property surveys that proved her boundary claims were false, easement agreements that protected my fence line, and purchase agreements that every Meadowbrook Estates resident had signed, acknowledging the ranch's existence and right to continue operations. But the most dramatic moment came when I displayed Tom Rodriguez's background investigation, revealing Stephanie's history of neighborhood conflicts and her current financial troubles. Mrs. Crowder has been involved in similar disputes at her 2 previous homes, I explained, and she's currently facing financial pressures that might explain her focus on property values rather than factual environmental concerns. The room erupted in angry murmurs as residents realized they'd been manipulated by someone who'd presented herself as a concerned neighbor while hiding her history of harassment and litigation. Several people demanded to know why Stephanie hadn't disclosed her previous HOA conflicts, and others questioned whether they could trust anything she'd told them about ranch operations. Stephanie tried to regain control by attacking my credibility and claiming that my legal background made me untrustworthy, but the damage was done. Her carefully constructed narrative had collapsed under the weight of official documentation and factual evidence that contradicted every major claim she'd made. The meeting ended with residents voting to censure Stephanie for providing false information and to withdraw HOA support for her anti-ranch campaign. Several neighbors apologized to me personally for believing misleading information, and the HOA board scheduled a special meeting to review her actions and consider removing her from the presidency. As the crowd dispersed, Stephanie approached me with fury, replacing her previous false confidence. "This isn't over," she hissed, clutching her laptop like a shield. "I'll find other ways to protect this community from your operation." But her threats rang hollow now that her credibility was destroyed and her support base had evaporated. The woman who'd tried to criminalize my family's ranch had ended up criminalizing herself through systematic harassment and fraudulent claims. The aftermath moved swiftly once residents understood how completely they'd been deceived. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove Stephanie from the presidency and to issue a formal apology for her unauthorized actions. More importantly, they passed resolutions acknowledging my property rights and prohibiting future interference with legitimate ranch operations. Several residents contacted me privately to express embarrassment about believing Stephanie's claims and to ask about purchasing grass-fed beef directly from my ranch. The relationship between Meadowbrook Estates and the Thompson Ranch transformed from conflict to cooperation as neighbors learned the facts about sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship. But Stephanie's troubles were just beginning. Tom Rodriguez's investigation had uncovered evidence that she'd been misusing HOA funds to pay for legal consultations and private investigators related to her personal campaign against my ranch. The HOA treasurer discovered over $4,000 in unauthorized expenditures that would need to be repaid immediately or result in criminal charges for misappropriation of community funds. More seriously, her false reports to environmental agencies and law enforcement constituted filing false reports, which carried criminal penalties under Texas law. The sheriff's department had opened an investigation into her theft allegations after Deputy Martinez reviewed my documentation and realized that Stephanie had knowingly filed false accusations. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality was also pursuing administrative penalties against Stephanie for filing frivolous complaints that had wasted state resources and created unnecessary burdens for a legitimate agricultural plaints operation. Their investigation revealed that she'd made similar false reports about other ranches in her previous communities, establishing a pattern of harassment that could result in federal charges. Most devastating for Stephanie personally was the civil lawsuit I filed for harassment, defamation, and intentional interference with business operations. As a retired attorney, I knew exactly how to document damages and build a case that would hold her financially responsible for the costs of defending against her fraudulent campaign. The lawsuit included claims for legal fees, lost business from negative publicity, time spent responding to false allegations, and punitive damages for malicious harassment. The total exceeded $50,000, an amount that would force Stephanie to choose between bankruptcy and selling her home to pay the judgment. Her attempts to hire attorneys to defend against the lawsuit revealed just how precarious her financial situation had become. 3 different law firms declined to represent her after reviewing the evidence, and the 4th demanded a retainer she couldn't afford. She was eventually forced to represent herself in court, facing an experienced property attorney with 23 years of litigation experience. The trial was a masterpiece of legal education for everyone involved. I presented 2 days of evidence showing Stephanie's systematic harassment, documented lies, and financial motivations for targeting my ranch. Expert witnesses testified about the environmental safety of my operations, the validity of my property boundaries, and the economic impact of her defamation campaign. Stephanie's self-representation was painful to watch as she tried to argue legal theories she didn't understand while ignoring rules of evidence she'd never learned. Her attempts to justify her actions by claiming community protection fell apart when confronted with official reports contradicting every allegation she'd made. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict that exceeded my damage claims. They awarded $68,000 in compensatory damages plus $30,000 in punitive damages, sending a clear message that community harassment disguised as environmental concern would not be tolerated. More importantly, the court issued a permanent injunction prohibiting Stephanie from making any further complaints or reports about my ranch operations without factual evidence supporting her claims. Violation of the injunction would result in immediate jail time for contempt of court. The financial pressure from the judgment forced Stephanie to sell her Meadowbrook Estates home and move to a rental property in a different county. Her pharmaceutical sales career ended when her employer learned about the criminal charges and civil judgment, and her attempts to find new employment were hampered by background checks that revealed her history of litigation and harassment. 6 months after the trial, I received a handwritten letter from Stephanie containing a brief apology and a check for the first installment of her court-ordered restitution. The woman who'd tried to destroy my family's ranch was now working 2 part-time jobs to pay for her failed harassment campaign. But the most satisfying outcome wasn't Stephanie's punishment. It was the transformation of my relationship with Meadowbrook Estates residents. The community that had been manipulated into opposing my ranch became its strongest supporters once they learned the truth about sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship. The annual Meadowbrook Ranch Day celebration drew over 100 residents for educational tours, local food tastings, and family activities that showcased the compatibility between responsible development and working agriculture. Children who'd been taught to fear my cattle were now comfortable helping with feeding and learning about animal husbandry from their neighbor who happened to understand both ranching and property law. The fence that had started this entire conflict became a symbol of cooperation rather than division. Working with interested residents, I installed educational markers along the fence line explaining the history of the ranch, the environmental benefits of cattle grazing, and the legal protections that preserve agricultural operations in suburban areas. Standing on my front porch 1 year later, watching Meadowbrook Estates children help with evening cattle feeding while their parents discussed sustainable farming practices, I reflected on how a false theft report had ultimately strengthened both my ranch operation and my relationship with the surrounding community. Stephanie Crowder had taught everyone an important lesson about the difference between genuine environmental concern and manipulative harassment disguised as community activism. Her systematic campaign of lies and legal threats had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the opposite result she'd intended. The fence my grandfather built in 1954 was still standing strong, now protected not just by property law, but by neighbors who understood its value to our shared rural heritage. And every month, when Stephanie's restitution check arrived in my mailbox, I was reminded that sometimes the best way to deal with a liar is to let them keep talking until they convince everyone else of the truth. The educational impact of our conflict extended far beyond Meadowbrook Estates, when the Texas Agricultural Extension Service asked me to develop a presentation about property rights and neighbor relations for their statewide seminar series. Speaking to audiences of ranchers and farmers across the state, I shared strategies for dealing with suburban encroachment and the importance of maintaining detailed documentation of property boundaries and agricultural practices. The presentation, titled "When City Meets Country: Protecting Agricultural Rights Through Legal Preparedness," became one of their most requested programs. Ranchers from El Paso to Houston contacted me for advice about dealing with similar harassment campaigns, and several attorney colleagues began specializing in agricultural defense cases based on the precedents established in our lawsuit. More personally satisfying was the impact on my own ranching operation. The publicity from Stephanie's failed campaign had generated unexpected interest in grass-fed beef from environmentally conscious consumers throughout the region. What started as attacks on my agricultural practices had actually educated potential customers about sustainable ranching methods and the environmental benefits of properly managed cattle operations. Within 18 months of the trial, I'd expanded my direct sales operation to include an online ordering system and regular delivery routes to Austin and San Antonio. The ranch that Stephanie had tried to eliminate as an environmental hazard was now being celebrated as a model of sustainable agriculture that other operations were attempting to replicate. The irony wasn't lost on anyone when the Texas Department of Agriculture selected my ranch for inclusion in their Green Acres program, which recognizes farms and ranches that exceed environmental standards while maintaining profitable operations. The same cattle operation that had been reported for environmental violations was now being used by the state as an example of how agriculture and conservation could work together. Stephanie's monthly restitution payments had become something of a community joke among Meadowbrook Estates residents, who would often ask about her latest check during neighborhood gatherings. Several neighbors had started referring to her payments as the Stephanie Scholarship Fund, since I was using the money to sponsor agricultural education programs for local schools. The educational tours I'd begun offering had evolved into a regular program that brought hundreds of students to the ranch each year. Working with county extension agents and environmental educators, we'd developed curriculum that taught children about water conservation, soil management, and the role of livestock in maintaining healthy grasslands. Watching suburban kids experience working agriculture for the first time never got old. Children who'd grown up thinking food came from grocery stores would spend hours learning about the complex ecosystem that supported cattle ranching, often returning home with new appreciation for the farmers and ranchers who fed their communities. The legal precedent established by our case had attracted attention from property rights organizations throughout Texas. The Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association published a detailed case study of Stephanie's harassment campaign and my legal response, using it as a training tool for ranchers facing similar suburban pressures. Most significantly, the Texas legislature had referenced our case when drafting new protections for agricultural operations threatened by frivolous complaints and harassment from residential developments. The right to ranch legislation included specific penalties for filing false environmental reports and provided legal remedies for farmers and ranchers facing organized campaigns of manufactured complaints. 2 years after the trial, I received an unexpected phone call from Jennifer Walsh at the TCEQ, who informed me that Stephanie had been permanently banned from filing environmental complaints in Texas after investigators discovered she'd made false reports about agricultural operations in 3 different counties. Her pattern of harassment had finally caught up with her in ways that would prevent future victims from enduring what I'd experienced. The investigation had revealed that Stephanie's anti-agriculture campaigns weren't random neighbor disputes, but part of a systematic pattern that suggested possible coordination with development interests seeking to eliminate agricultural operations from suburban areas. While criminal charges weren't filed due to difficulty proving intent, the administrative penalties and permanent ban effectively ended her ability to weaponize environmental agencies against working farms and ranches. Perhaps the most satisfying development came when Carol Henderson, who'd replaced Stephanie as HOA president, contacted me about establishing a formal partnership between Meadowbrook Estates and the Thompson Ranch. The agreement included educational programs for residents, agricultural tours for their children, and cooperative projects that benefited both the subdivision and the ranch. The partnership had generated national attention from planning organizations interested in successful models of agricultural residential cooperation. Urban planners from across the country visited our area to study how proper education and communication could transform potential conflicts into mutually beneficial relationships. The fence that had triggered Stephanie's theft accusations was now featured on interpretive signs that explained the history of our property and the legal frameworks that protected agricultural operations. What had started as a symbol of conflict had become a teaching tool that helped visitors understand the importance of respecting property rights and agricultural heritage. Standing at that same fence line on a recent morning, Watching Meadowbrook Estates residents walk their dogs along trails that now included educational markers about sustainable ranching, I marveled at how completely the situation had been transformed. The community that had been manipulated into fearing my ranch now celebrated it as one of their most valuable neighborhood amenities. Stephanie's final restitution payment arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 3 years after she'd first appeared at my fence line with her portfolio full of false accusations. The check represented the end of her legal obligations, but the lessons from her failed harassment campaign would continue benefiting agricultural communities throughout Texas for years to come. Her attempted destruction of my family's ranch had ultimately strengthened protections for agricultural operations across the state, while educating suburban residents about the value of working agriculture in their communities. Sometimes the best way to defend your rights is to let your opponents reveal their true character to everyone watching. The Thompson Ranch continued operating as it had for 70 years, but now with greater legal protections, stronger community support, and expanded educational mission that honored both my grandfather's legacy and the hard-learned lessons about dealing with those who mistake legal intimidation for legitimate authority.